All right, it looks like we have a critical mass of people in the room. Good afternoon and welcome to IBO's Fiscal Outlook webinar. This is IBO's first webinar and we are delighted that you could attend. I am Elizabeth Brown, IBO's Communication Director, and I am joined today by George Sweeting, IBO's Deputy Director, and Jonathan Rosenberg, IBO's Director of Budget Review. A little bit of background, but I'm sure most of you know this. The Independent Budget Office is a publicly funded city agency. It is independent of both the mayor and the city council and is charged with providing nonpartisan information on the city's budget and tax revenues. So in that vein, today we'll be presenting findings from our recent Fiscal Outlook report. We released this report just over 2 weeks ago. It contains our most recent economic and revenue forecast, including tax projections, as well as an analysis of the city's most recent financial plan. That financial plan is the last one of the de Blasio administration. It was released at the end of November. The Adams administration will be releasing its first financial plan by February 16th, and so that's forthcoming. And shortly after that's released, we'll be providing an analysis of that as well. Before I hand it over to George and Jonathan, who will be presenting the findings, I wanted to say that we will be taking questions during the presentation, and I will be compiling them and asking them after the presentation. So if you have a question now or anything that comes up during either one of their presentations, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit it. I'll put them together and we'll ask as many as we have time for. Just a little more housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and as long as that goes smoothly, we will be putting it on our website. We will also be putting on our website the slides. We have interactive slides that George and Jonathan will be presenting today. And of course, a copy of our Fiscal Outlook report, the report that this presentation is based on, is also on our website. So a little plug there. And with that, I'd like to George Sweeting, our Deputy Director, to take it away. George, you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Beth said, I'm George Sweeting, Deputy Director at IBO, and I'll be discussing the economic and tax forecasts that went into our Outlook report. But first, let's just quickly review what the main findings, the main points from the report. So in addition to the human losses associated with the pandemic, it also led to severe economic shocks. And in many ways, New York City and the country as a whole have yet to fully recover from those shocks. Some sectors of the economy were hit particularly hard, particularly in terms of employment. And in many cases, the hardest hit sectors had some of the lowest average wages among the sectors in the city. So almost 2 years ago now, when we first estimated the likely effects of the pandemic, we also anticipated that in addition to the economic shocks, there would be a local fiscal shock. And IBO was projecting large deficits that would require budget actions to address by the city. However, better than expected tax revenue and $13 billion in federal assistance have left the city in much better shape. IBO is now estimating that the city will actually have a budget surplus in 2022, fiscal year 2022, and only modest budget gaps for fiscal years 2023 through 2025. However, the fiscal foundation supporting these estimates may be less solid than it looks. And there are innumerable uncertainties in our forecast. In fact, well, I guess it is numerable because if you look in our report, we use the word uncertain or some form of the word uncertain 19 times. So in a 28-page report. So let me first take a look at some data on employment. And this probably is, it definitely shows a bad sign for the city. In this chart, the dark blue line is New York City. The light blue line is the rest of the United States. So it's the United States minus New York City. And what we're showing here is this line up here is 100, this line that's labeled 100%. That's the, we're showing here the decline in jobs in percentage terms from what the economy had at the end of 2019 calendar year. So we're treating that as effectively the last quarter in which the pandemic was not having an effect. So from between March and May of 2020, New York City lost almost 900,000 jobs. And you can see the huge decline here. That was 19% of the jobs that had been filled in the fourth quarter of 2019. So that we're down in this initial plunge, we're down at about 81% of the pre-pandemic level. The rest of the US also had a major job loss in that period, but it was not quite as deep as the cities. The rest of the US lost about 12% of its jobs. Now there was a recovery that begins almost immediately, so that this is a short-lived recession, and the city and the rest of the United States, the rebound in percentage point terms is actually pretty similar, so that we wind up following really a parallel track. And the gap between the percentages, as you gradually add jobs, we get closer and closer to that 100% line. That gap doesn't really begin to narrow until early 2023. And of course, because we had lost such a larger, the percentage of jobs that we lost was so much larger than for the rest of the US, we would actually have to be growing faster than the rest of the US in order to catch up. But instead, we're just sort of roughly paralleling them. And therefore, by our projections, the rest of the US will regain its pre-pandemic level of employment by the middle of calendar year 2022. The city doesn't actually regain 100%, and here's that 100% line, until the end of calendar year 2025. So that's a very big difference between how the city economy and the economy of the rest of the country is behaving. And it's also worth noting that we've become more pessimistic about when we will regain the pre-pandemic level. 6 months ago, we were projecting that it would happen in the middle of 2024. We've now pushed that out another 6 months. Now, bear with me 1 second here while I roll back time. 2020. So, although the employment picture overall, is discouraging for the city, there are important differences by sector, where in terms of both the losses that initially occurred and the pace of recovery in those sectors. So this chart for each of these major sectors, and these are not all the sectors in the city, but they're most of the major sectors. For each year, what it shows, and for each sector, is how much jobs were either lost or gained. Now, for 2020, every one of these sectors lost jobs. And so we just start at 0 here. The sector with the largest decline is leisure and hospitality, which is made up of people who work in hotels and restaurants, entertainment venues. And because the shutdowns there were almost complete, the job losses in that industry have been enormous. They were about 230,000, or a decline of almost 50%. Other sectors that were badly affected included trade, where they lost about 17% of the jobs. Transportation lost about 16% of its jobs. Finance went down about 7%. Let's see, we'll jump up here to professional services, where it's only a 5% decline, even though they lost over 80,000 jobs. And that's just because it's a pretty large sector. So that there, the percentage decline was considerably smaller. And similarly in the information sector, where the decline was 9%. Now, if we go to 2021, most of these sectors have begun regaining jobs. There are two that are still going down. Transportation still had a loss in 2021, relatively small, and financial activities also had a decline. But the others are beginning to grow, and notably information up here has almost offset its loss from 2020 by its gain in 2021. The other sectors, that's not true. So when we get to 2022, finally, all of the sectors are regaining jobs. And that continues through 2023, 4, and 5. However, by 2025, there are still 3 sectors: leisure and hospitality, trade, transportation, excuse me, it's 4 sectors, and finance, are all still expected to be below their 2019 levels. In leisure and hospitality, they're still expected to be down 15%, or 72,000 jobs from the pre-pandemic level. And that outlook is shaped by our anticipation that there will be a weak recovery in international tourism, tourists visiting the US from abroad, and also a pretty significant decline in business travel to the city. The experience we've all had with using Zoom and WebEx and whatever has shown that you can get, it may not be a perfect replacement, but you can get an awful lot of the benefits of a meeting by having people stay where they are and connect electronically, rather than paying the expense of flying people into a city and the cost while they're visiting. So we expect that's going to be almost, that will really be a permanent adjustment coming out of the pandemic, that business travel will be reduced. I should note also that the industries that didn't regain their 2019 level by 2025, it's notable that they also tend to have lower average wages than those that did recover all of their jobs. And if we consider just information, and which is up here at the top again, and leisure and hospitality, and compare them. So information, which is mostly technology companies and content creation, they lost 19,000 jobs, or 9%, in the first year in 2020. But they're expected to have fully recovered all of their jobs, or just about all of them, by the end of 2021. And actually by 2025, when you add all of these gains together, they will be about 10% above where they were in the pre-pandemic level. This is because the reason the job losses weren't so severe here is that much of the work done in this industry can be done remotely. So even though the economy largely shut down in the early part of 2020, this work could continue, and people did not lose their jobs. And the average wage in this sector is $167,000. Compare that to leisure and hospitality. It was this shows clearly it was the hardest hit sector in terms of job losses. And this is because in this industry, most of the work is done in person, and it can't be done remotely. So if there's a shutdown, that means there's no work available. And in comparison to the 167,000 average wage in information, for leisure and hospitality, it's about 57,000, significantly lower. So turn these off. These do not want to stay off. So while the employment picture is troubling, there are some positive signs for the city economy. In this chart, we're looking at personal income, which is that's a sort of statistical construct that the federal government makes to help us understand the amount of earnings and other monetary compensation that people get. So in the aggregate, New York City personal income, which are this is these bars, it actually grew from 2019, when it was about $658 billion. It grew by about 4%, 4.3% to 2020. And it's expected to continue growing in 2021, and then throughout the rest of the forecast period. And that may seem counterintuitive, given what I've been saying about the local employment story. But in order to understand what's going on here, you need to look not at the total, but at the components. And there are many components of personal income. We're only going to focus on two of them. One is wages and salaries, which is by far the largest component of personal income. And wages and salaries actually fell. This is more consistent with what we see in the employment side. It fell from 2019 to 2020. Not much, but it did fall. And that reflects the loss of jobs and wages during the recession. But notably, that loss was more than offset by an increase in another component, which are called transfer payments. And these are payments from the government to individuals, such as unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, and refundable tax credits. And in several of the fiscal recovery and relief pieces of legislation that Jonathan will talk about in a little bit, also included either supplements to existing transfer payment programs or created new ones, such as the stimulus checks. So transfer payment, and another thing to note is that transfer payments are generally taxable, so that even though it's not, it may be replacing lost wages, it's taxed essentially the same as if you had wage income, so that it helps to sustain the city's personal income tax at a time when wages and salaries are falling. So between 2019 and 2020, transfer payments grew by 41%, and another 8% is expected when we get the full data for 2021. So in fact, it's notable that in 2020, transfer payments are the only component of personal income that grew. All of the others were stable or fell. So that's a sign that in terms of the city's fiscal condition, that the effects of the recession have been to some extent mitigated by the aggressive fiscal policy by the federal government that acted to sustain income, even though it's a different form from wages and salaries. It's being done by transfers from government. It's still supporting personal income, and therefore is available to be taxed by the city's income tax. So another good sign for the city is that we've had another good year on Wall Street. And it's a good sign for the city's, at least the fiscal condition of the city. So in this chart, these are annual observations all the way back to 1990 up to 2021. And the dark blue bars are the net operating income of the financial sector firms in the city. And the light blue, which we actually show as negatives here, this is net interest expense of those firms. One of the largest expenses these firms have is the interest they have to pay in order to get the money to be used in their operations. And the silver line here, this is the net profits of the firms, the annual profits. You'll notice that it looks negative here. This is because this is in constant dollars, so that these are inflation adjusted dollars. This is the what had been the peak, which so far is the record earnings for Wall Street firms in 2009. That's coming out of the 2008 recession, and this was $61 billion in measured nominally, or about 84 billion in today's dollars. Now, the notable thing here is that in the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021, there have been profits here, of a significant amount. Adjusted for inflation, it's about 68 billion last year, and we don't know exactly what it's going to be in 2021 yet. But the profits have been high, but not primarily due to operating revenues, because you can see that these, while they're positive, they're not as big as some of these years back earlier in history. However, it's not the profit, it's not the operating revenue, it's the very low cost of interest that's making it possible for the firms to be generating such large profits. And this reflects the Federal Reserve's loose monetary policy that they've put in place. But the question will be, what happens when the Federal Reserve begins to tighten monetary policy? And in fact, it's pretty clear now that they're embarking on exactly doing that. So we'll have to see, but at least up until, for the last 2 years, the very low interest rates combined with, with moderate net operating income has generated significant profits for the Wall Street firms. And that flows through into the city's tax base in terms of the business and corporate tax on these firms, and to the extent that there are extra bonus payments that are made, that's taxable under the city's personal income tax. So let me just finally turn to a look at the city's tax forecast, and this is our projection of the city's what the city's tax revenues will look like. The 2021 column over here, these are actuals, but the rest of this is our forecast. So even though the pandemic spanned all 12 months of fiscal year 2021, tax revenue grew by almost 4% in 2021 to a total of about $65 billion. And much of that, all of that was really driven by growth in 3 of the city's biggest tax components. One is personal income, which grew by about 11%. Some of this probably had to do with changes that investors made in anticipation that capital gains taxes were going to go up in the as part of the fiscal policy changes that the Biden administration was bringing in. So in order to have the gains taxed at the lower rates prevailing in calendar year 2020, they shifted payments, they shifted realizations from calendar year 2021 to calendar year 20, and that helped sustain. But much of that activity for city fiscal year purposes is reflected in 2021. So those realizations helped bump up the personal income tax revenue in 2020. Excuse me, in 2021. Also, as I mentioned before, the transfer payments, helped hold up the personal income tax, so it avoided a decline that might have been anticipated there. Another sector, another business tax source is there's a set of 3 or 4 business taxes that the city imposes, business income taxes. They also went up about 10%, 10.5%. And then the city's property tax, which is the largest and usually the most stable tax source, that also went up almost 5.5%. And it's important to remember that the tax bills that generated this revenue in 2021 for property tax, they were based on pre-pandemic 2019 economic conditions. There are lags in the city's tax system in terms of when the assessments are done and then how that relates to the coming years, coming fiscal years tax bills. So, even though we call this 2021 revenue, it doesn't really reflect the economics of fiscal year 2021 for the property tax. Picture is quite different when we get to the current year, 2022. We expect tax revenue as a whole to decline by about 2.4%. And this will be the first decline in total tax revenue since 2009, although the decline then was much larger. And the biggest thing pulling it down is is a 5.5% decline in the property tax. This is the first year-over-year decline since at least 2001. It's notable that for this 2022 fiscal year, the finance department altered assessment methodology for commercial properties, and they were trying to get ahead of what they anticipated would be declines in net operating income and market values for commercial properties. And so they reduced the total assessed value for on the 2020 roll for these properties in the aggregate by about 12.7%. We think there's some evidence that they may have overshot how much of an adjustment was needed to account for the impact, at least the immediately observable impact of the pandemic on commercial properties. We'll see how that works out over the next year or two. Business taxes are also expected to decline in 2022. Personal income tax is expected to fall by about $1 billion. This is partly because of that shifting of capital gains realizations that I mentioned earlier. And although those, these are 3 of the city's largest taxes, and they all do begin growing again once you get out into 23, 24, and 25. The decline for 2022 is partially offset by strength in some of these other taxes. So I'll just quickly mention a few of these. So turn that one off. Okay. So from 2021 to 2022, there's very strong growth in sales tax. Sales tax revenue, at least our forecast of it, we think it's going to be up about 18% this year. Some of that has to do with when the pandemic led to shutdowns early in 2020, many people shifted purchasing from services, many of which are not taxed under the sales tax, to goods. And so that shift, they shifted from goods to services. But now that the there's some return to normal economic behavior as the pandemic, although the Omicron variant looks like it breaks that trend. There's still it seems to be a trend towards a more normal economic activity. So as that occurs, we get more of a shift back to goods purchases by consumers, and that's helping to drive up the sales tax. There's also an increase in property transfer taxes. That's actually a set of taxes that the city imposes when properties are sold or financed. This reflects the relatively strong market for residential properties. Commercial properties are still lagging, but even there's some improvement this year over last year. And then the hotel occupancy tax, which is this, I'll click out the hotel occupancy tax is probably the tax that was most affected by the recession. With the closing of the hotels, there was no longer occupancy, and the tax revenue plummeted. It was about $465 million in 2020, and it falls off to less than 100 in 2021. So we do have a recovery here. In fact, it almost triples from 2021 to 2022, but it's still well below its pre-pandemic base. So this is recovery that looks pretty brisk off of a relatively small base. And in the remaining years of the forecast period, 2023 to 25, we see average annual growth of about 3%, which is sort of in the range of what the city was experiencing in the second half of the previous decade, from about 2015 to 2018 or 19. And it will reach a total of $71 billion by 2025. I should note that IBO's revenue projections exceed the Office of Management and Budgets estimates each year by at least $1.5 billion. One reason for that is that OMB did not update its economic and revenue forecast for the November plan, and we did. So that that immediately causes some difference, but some of it's also actually based on differences in our economic and our economic assumptions and how that translates into the city's tax base. And with that, I'll hand it off to Jonathan.
Thanks, George.
Yes.
Again, thank you. I'm Jonathan Rosenberg, Director of Budget Review at IBO. And so moving from taxes to total city revenue, obviously taxes are the single largest source of revenue for the city. And in FY21, taxes, which are here in this dark blue or opaque blue, made up 67% of total city revenue, and total city revenues are listed on the right side here, was 98.2 billion at the time. In FY22, as George mentioned, taxes are forecast to decline slightly, and total city revenue increases up to $104.4 billion. So taxes only make up 61% of total city revenues forecast in FY22. Eventually, taxes, as they grow through the forecast period, and total revenue declines in 23 and then grows slightly through 25. Eventually, taxes as a percentage of total city revenue returns to 69% by the end of the forecast period. But the decline in FY22, it's partly the result of the dip in tax collections that George described from 21 to 22, but it's also the result of, and I will add these to the chart here. It's also the result of an increase in other revenues, particularly state and federal, and more particularly federal categorical grants, which make up in 21, federal grants made up approximately 13% of total city revenue. By 22, they make up approximately 16%. And in fact, 22 is the first time in recent history that federal dollars actually exceed state dollars that are coming to the city. As you can see in the rest of the plan, federal dollars return to kind of a pre-pandemic level, whereas state remains about the same and taxes go up. So the ratios change, but at least in the current year, federal dollars, and even in the prior year, federal dollars make up a much larger portion of the total city revenue than in previous years. So what's going on here? What is going on here? There we go. So basically, as many of you might know, it's a result of the influx of federal aid from two large relief packages that were passed by Congress in 2021. The first, the Coronavirus Response Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, CRSA, provided $2.4 billion to the city, primarily or for education and higher education purposes. And the second act, the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, provided two tranches of funding. One that went directly to the state, to the localities, the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, of which the city received $5.9 billion. And the second tranche of money was $4.8 billion that was specifically to be used for education and higher education expenses. The larger of the two, the $5.9 billion, had some requirements, although fewer restrictions than most federal dollars that come to the city. The legislation required that these dollars be used to either replace lost revenue from the pandemic, to respond to the public health and economic impact of COVID, to provide premium pay for essential workers, and to invest in infrastructure. So how the city used or plans to use through their from FY21 through FY25 this $13 billion. Well, the largest chunk of the money, $7.6 billion, is for education purposes, and that rightly so, because two of the tranches of money that are listed on the right side of this slide are specifically for education. So education makes up over 58% of the entire $13 billion. The second largest portion of the relief funds are used for revenue replacement, about $2.5 billion. And those are through a number of different agencies where the city assumes to use federal dollars in place of city tax levy. The other areas that the city is using these federal dollars is about $760 million for health-related expenses, another $750 million for economic development, 600 million or so for homeless and housing purposes, and about 550 million for social services, and then of course other category. So the recent narrative regarding this financial plan, and as George mentioned, this is the November plan that was released last November, is that regarding this budget, is that the budget placed a lot of focus on the size of the, the narratives placed a lot of focus, on the size of the FY22 budget and expenditure size in relation to prior years. And this is the city's largest budget ever in absolute size. And we can see why this is based upon this chart right here. You can see that city-funded spending has grown slightly from year to year, and goes up and down a little bit as we go on into the out years of the forecast. But the real growth in expenditures is non-city funded, as I spoke earlier. Over the last 2 years, from FY20 actuals to 22, non-city expenditures are planned to grow by over 41%. But by the end of this planned period, non-city spending returns to similar to pre-pandemic levels. The growth rate actually in total expenditures over the planned period is only 1.5% annually. So growth across the plan is not quite as great as it is from year to year. So this brings us to what IBO projects in terms of how we project the plan to look. In the November plan, the mayor, as according to the charter, has to provide a balanced budget for the current fiscal year, that being fiscal 2022. But in the November plan, the mayor is not required to present the out years of the plan, and in this case, it's 23 through 25 in balance. That only happens at the preliminary budget, which he will be releasing later in February, actually. So at the time of the release of this budget, the gaps, meaning the expenditures over the revenues that planned to be taken in, range from $2.9 billion in 2023 to about $2.1 billion in 25. What the mayor's plan did not include, and I'll go back in time here, is at the time of the beginning of the pandemic in April of 2020, Mayor de Blasio had to, of course, balance his financial plan, and he included in this plan $1 billion of annual savings, including in each year through the out years, for unallocated labor savings. And the understanding was that the city and its labor unions would eventually come to an agreement on a plan that would save the city $1 billion each year. After a bit of time and a few some little savings accounted for, the federal dollars from the stimulus plans started coming, or the relief plans started coming to the city. And there was a decision made in the November plan to lower those $1 billion of unallocated planned labor savings in the out years to $500 million. And in fact, to rescind the $1 billion needed in the current year. They used the federal dollars to replace that. Because these, as the name shows, these are unallocated and not yet determined savings, we at IBO have included those as part of the gap to be filled. So this line, the third line down, is our re-estimated gap, which is just the OMB's presented gaps plus the $500 million of unallocated savings. So you can see that those range from about $3.3 to $2.6 billion throughout the years of the plan. So when we move down to this next line shows IBO's differences between, and this is what George mentioned on his last slide, the differences between our tax and revenue estimates and OMBs. And in the case, our revenue estimates exceed OMBs by about a range of $1.5 billion to $1.8 billion a year, primarily as a result of the difference between our estimates for property and personal income for the most part, and some other taxes as well. In addition, we've also analyzed the expenditure side of the mayor's plan, and we have some differences in expenditures as well. Those range from $600 million to $100 million. Just a note, though, that negative numbers here increase the gap, positive numbers decrease the gap. So these negatives would be increasing any gap that we would be creating. And these numbers, these re-estimates are a number of different places, but some examples, and the larger ones are in the Department of Education. We believe the city has underestimated the cost of charter schools, and especially, or specifically charter schools, and also uniform overtime costs. We believe the city has underestimated those costs as well, among others. So what that leads us to is the revenue differences minus the expenditure differences lead us to the IBO pricing differences, which is the amount of additional resources that IBO feels the city has in each of those fiscal years, ranging from the current year of $938 million to $1.6 billion in 2024. Now, the city and OMB will usually use any surplus in the current year to prepay expenses for next year. So while we don't assume how these dollars will be spent, we take a similar tact and we'll use these dollars to prepay 2023 expenses. So this is just a prepayment of 2023 expenses. So when you add up our IBO pricing differences in the out years, plus any prepayments, which we only have in 23, and then take and add that back to those re-estimated gaps up here, you have our re-estimated gaps of what we think the gaps would theoretically be over those years. And as you see, they range from $1 billion to $1.6 billion. And as George mentioned early on in his presentation, these are relatively modest gaps, particularly in relation to the overall size of the budgets of over $100 billion. One thing to note is that each year, the current plan, like many of the previous plans, includes $1.25 billion of reserve funds that are unallocated expenditures that could be used to, that could be reduced and thus reduce these gaps. 1.25 billion would actually eliminate the gap in 2025. So, looking at it at this point, we see relatively modest gaps going forward. But, and there's always a but, and these assumptions, like with any financial plan, come with, of course, risks. And George mentioned them at the beginning, but this plan may have some of the most consequential risks of any in recent memory. And foremost among these risks is the course of the pandemic, of course. Recent history provides little guidance on how this pandemic will play out in the near future. There are many unknowns, and some we will have to consider are how it will affect the city's revenues. Will tourism return, and how will this affect the leisure and hospitality industry? Will MTA ridership return to pre-pandemic levels, and how will that affect the authority's finances? Will office workers return, or is remote work going to be the new normal? And will out-migration of residents continue as they find they don't need to live near where they work? A second assumption that, or a second pressure point to what our assumptions are, is the demand for office space. It's kind of dovetailing with the last questions that I posed, is particularly how this demand for office space will be affected by the pandemic. Recently, we have seen a significant increase in sublease vacancies, presumably, we presume due to firms shutting down or using less space, as well as an increase in primary lease vacancies. Leases are oftentimes a product of a cycle, usually a 10-year cycle. So we could see over the next few years growth in primary lease vacancies as some of these leases that businesses currently hold expire. And we, of course, are uncertain how as we move forward, how the next round of leases will differ from the previous one. Will businesses seek to downsize their office footprint or eliminate office usage in total? And kind of segueing there, decisions made by these businesses regarding office space also tangentially is related to, as I mentioned before, the well-being of the MTA and ridership in the MTA as well. Another point that we have to consider is the federal funds, the relief funds that I mentioned earlier. These funds have plugged a lot of holes in the financial plan and provided additional revenues to create new programs and expand existing programs. After 2025, these funds will no longer be available. And we estimate that in just DOE alone, the Department of Education alone, that $3.2 billion of the current funding that I showed before, about $7 billion of that, $7 billion of funding, $3.2 billion of that is for long-term programs. The largest of which is the expansion of the 3K program for educating children of age of 3. Overall, we estimate the city, just in the Department of Education, will need to replace nearly $800 million in funding for these long-term programs by FY26, and that's only for the Department of Education. And lastly, there's municipal labor contracts. The current financial plan includes some funding for wages increases for the city workforce, but not for anything similar to prior increases that have been provided. By the end of calendar 2022, we estimate that the entire workforce, the entire city workforce, will be working under expired contracts. And we assume that if the next round of contracts is settled at a rate similar to the last round that was settled, it would cost the city nearly $500 million in the current fiscal year, and that would increase to about $2.5 billion annually by fiscal 2025. So while we estimate that the city's out-year gaps are relatively modest, and there is enough planned revenue and other non-allocated resources available to support the planned expenditures, the city's economy we see is recovering far more gradually than the nation's, and it's not quite as robustly as we predicted just a half a year ago. The level of uncertainty behind the generally reassuring numbers suggests the need for extraordinary vigilance when assessing the city's fiscal outlook. I thank you for taking your time to listen, and I open it up to Beth. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, George. So reminder, if you have questions and we have some in the during the presentation, just put them in the Q&A and I can ask as many as we can. So the first question we have has to do with employment in the social services and health sector, particularly related to nonprofits, but could you talk a little bit about where that went at the beginning of the pandemic? And I think there's a rosier picture there, especially when you compare it to some of the other sectors, I guess particularly health.
Yes, in the health and social services sector of the economy, our projections are that there will be a pretty brisk recovery in the, particularly in the health sector, and not just at hospitals, but also in home health and some of those areas. The job losses were, they were certainly not as profound as what you had, say, in leisure and hospitality, but there, as with other sectors, there was a decline in 2020. But the recovery has been, that's one of the few low wage sectors where the recovery has actually been fairly brisk.
Another question, looking at the impact of, you talked about remote work and a little bit about out-migration. What is IBO thinking about the impact of remote work and potential out-migration on tax revenues? And was that a factor in our forecast for the out years?
In terms of the impact of remote work on tax revenues, at the moment, we don't believe it's been that significant because, certainly in the early months of the pandemic, a lot of the moves out of the city, people moved to a second home that they might have had in the mountains or at the shore, or people, I think younger people, there was a fair amount wound up back in their parents' house, out of the city. That's somewhat anecdotal, but I think there's something to that. So in those cases, for the most part, people kept their official residency as in the city, and their employer, in most cases, was still a city employer. So the taxes, at least at that point, there was not a big effect on taxes. Now that's, the risk to the city is that changes over time as people, become very comfortable and used to working, not just, in the mountains of New York State, but, maybe in the mountains of Idaho. And they really sever their ties with the city that makes them taxable to the city. There's a huge interest in this. People are, many researchers, including people at IBO, are trying to make sense of this and the different conflicting data sources that are available. There are census estimates, there are estimates based on, IRS change in address data. There's zip code change, people filing for change of address with the Postal Service. The Census Bureau has its own set of estimates about relocations. A really important question, but I don't think we have an answer yet.
Sticking with tax revenues for a second, we have a question about the recent the fiscal year 23 tentative assessment rule. What's your reaction to it, and how does it compare to IBO's forecast?
IBO's forecast was, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but we were expecting growth in the property tax revenue from 22 to 23. And that's mostly driven by assessment changes. The tentative assessment roll has shown a rebound in commercial property assessments. There's also pretty strong growth in Class 1 properties, which we were anticipating. The change in the commercial assessments, reopens the question about whether the city really, made too large of an adjustment on the 2022 roll. Then we're not back to, with these changes in the tentative assessment roll that just came out this week, there's a bounce back from the very low assessments of 2022, which might indicate that that they had gone too far. But it's also important to note that it's still below the 2021 levels. So they bounced back, but didn't recover everything that was given up in 22. And we'll have more to say on this.
I'm sure. A question about PEGs. So the Adams administration has recently proposed a PEG cut. Well, not just proposed it, put it out there in a letter of 3% for most city agencies. Do you feel it's justified?
Sure. We can probably both take this one. I think that as we've presented, in the last 45 minutes or so, IBO feels that at least as the current financial plan sits, that it is actually well balanced and in a good shape. We also presented a lot of out year, risks to our forecasts. So I think that in general, it's always a good idea for agencies to look at their plans and look at what they're expending things on, and to take look at where they can reduce expenditures. Oftentimes things continue for years without being looked at, and so it is good for agencies to have an annual look to increase their efficiencies and effectiveness in producing what their goals. That being said, sometimes a PEG program and setting certain levels for every agency, or exempting certain agencies, as there's been discussion of, can lead to different incentives, and certain agencies are given credit for revenues as opposed to having to cut things. So there's always needs, having using a kind of a one type of tool, I guess, using one tool for all across, and not allowing for some nuanced changes across there is probably not I don't know if it's necessarily the right way to go. But I think that definitely the agencies need to take a look at their plans and what they're spending dollars on every year, probably even more than every year.
Thanks. Another question we had was about the non-city expenditures and how we see those go down. We see a bump in 2022 and then go down in the out years. Can you give some examples of what that might include and what will happen after the federal funding? What you think might happen after the federal funding runs out?
Well, I mean, in terms of the federal, the ARPA and the HRSA money, yeah. I don't have a lot of, as I said, a lot of that money was to replace dollars that were lost. So revenue replacement, about $2.5 billion of that 13 billion was revenue replacement. And that was all in 21 and 22 pretty much. So it was straight taking money that was originally, or taking expenses that were originally to be spent, funded by city funds, and using federal funds for that one period of time. In the out years, of course, those expenses will have to be funded by city funds or from some other source. Then there were things such as I mentioned, like UPK, 3K program at DOE, other things that are programs that last throughout the plan, at least to FY25. Other areas there that have been, I know that one of the things was like a city cleanup corps was a lot of dollars. There's an indirect rate to fund the indirect rate for nonprofits. There's a lot, I mean, there's hundreds. And in fact, IBO is sometime down the road going to hopefully be initiating a tracker of these federal relief dollars that will show more detail as to where exactly those dollars are being spent. if that can put in that little plug.
That's a great plug to end it with. Maybe our next webinar will be about the funding tracker. George, if I don't know if you have anything to add, but we've come up to 3 o'clock. I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us for joining us, and George and Jonathan, thanks so much for your presentations. Again, this will be posted on our website along with the slides that Jonathan and George went through, and of course the Fiscal Outlook report if you want to read all 28 pages. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.